There's a ton of information available on how to effectively learn languages. Yet almost everyone who attempts to learn one fail. This is because a lot of the information given to you is straight up false, leading you to the wrong approaches, guaranteed to leave you starved for results. So in this video, I'll be going over 3 big language learning myths that you need to avoid if you want to learn a new language. Let's get started with myth number 1. The first myth is that children learn languages way differently and quicker than adults do. Now, this belief that children have this magical ability of learning languages and that any adult attempting the same thing is bound to fall short of their achievements is something that I think holds a lot of people back from even starting to learn a language and attempting it seriously. And while it isn't a complete myth, I do think more context is required to understand this better. Now, for one, children are surrounded by native speakers every day from the day they're born, which means they're getting language into their head every day for years. This is quite different to the approach that most adults take when they're trying to learn a new language. On top of that, a 5-year-old being able to have a basic conversation is going to be a whole lot more impressive than a 25-year-old doing the same thing. And that's not to mention the fact that a 5-year-old will spend close to their whole day practicing that language, while a 25-year-old will be spending maybe a few hours a week practicing the language. So that's a very big difference. I mean, even immigrants moving to a new country will usually tend to seek out places where their native language is spoken. So this means that there's basically no one who's learning languages the same way that children does. Which means that there's no wonder the results are going to be quite different. People will see this difference in results and fail to even entertain the idea of an adult learning a language in the same way a child would do. But if an adult were to try and learn with tons of listening to the language, as well as taking advantage of a few tools that children cannot, such as spaced repetition technology and maybe a bit of grammar study, I really don't think the results will be all that different. Now, there is a hypothesis called the critical period hypothesis that states that there is a critical period of age for learning languages. But it actually only ties age to ultimate attainment in a language, meaning the highest level you can get to. So yeah, if you start learning a language at 30 years old, then you're probably never going to get as fluent as a native speaker who started learning the day they were born. But that doesn't mean you're going to learn at a snail's pace compared to that native speaker either. So my biggest issue here, and why I thought it was important to address this myth, is really just because it's often used as an excuse for lazy or even non-existent language learning. So the point I'm trying to make here is that even though there definitely exists a critical period in childhood for learning languages, that doesn't mean that the results of an adult trying to learn a language will be significantly worse than a child doing it. Because there are quite a lot of things the adult has in their favor too, such as just higher IQ and access to more resources. So instead of trying to use a completely different approach than children do, try to use a pretty similar one, but also take advantage of the knowledge of language learning and what you've taught yourself in your native language to help you acquire a new one. Now for the second myth, something I think is almost, if not more prominent than the first one. And it's the notion that you have to practice how to speak in order to learn how to speak. And this is another one of those half myths that's true in the sense that practicing speaking will improve your speaking. But it's more so a myth in the sense that practicing speaking isn't what's going to get you good at speaking, even though that might sound a bit counterintuitive. So imagine for a second you're trying to learn how to make a really good pasta. But all you have available is pasta and nothing else. Now with that, what can you really learn how to do? All I can think of is basically learning the best cook time, and that's about it. But now if you were to add in a few vegetables and spices, well, all of a sudden you can learn a whole lot more. And add a few sauces and maybe some meat in there and you got yourself a full meal. You can learn how to prepare each one of those ingredients perfectly, how to mix them together, how to add the perfect spices and make the sauce properly and all that stuff, right? Now, this analogy works pretty much the exact same way to language learning. Yes, you can technically practice speaking at any stage, but there's just not a whole lot of things you can do with a packet of pasta and nothing else. So you're really better off spending your time and resources trying to learn more and getting a few more ingredients, aka getting to a higher level of the language, before you start practicing speaking, which is refining your usage of those ingredients. Because even if you know the best way to use those ingredients, you're probably looking to make it at least something close to a full meal at some point, even if it's not the fanciest of dishes. Now, I hope this analogy makes at least some sense to you guys, and it's not just my inner Italian speaking, because I thought it was a pretty good way of explaining this. But basically what I'm trying to say here is that your focus shouldn't be to improve how you speak via speaking, but rather doing so via increasing how much of the language you can comprehend, aka expanding the amount of ingredients you have, right? Because if that gets to a high enough level and you have the best ingredients possible, then all you have to do is do a little bit of fine tuning on how to use those and you'll be able to speak without a problem. Practically everyone who can't speak a language yet don't need to speak more, they just need to learn more. If they had another 1,000 hours of listening practice under their belts, then I have no doubts in my mind they'd be able to speak way better than they currently do. Myth number 3 is that of memorization for language learning. And it ties into what I said about comprehension being the key to increased speaking skills as well. See, the vast majority of language learning approaches are centered around memorizing and learning things. The focus is always learning new words, memorizing the way to conjugate verbs, and actively understanding and trying to recall the way the language works. But this is really completely backwards to how language is actually acquired. Trying to learn all the ins and outs of the language explicitly also subsequently then means that when you're trying to speak or understand something in the language, you'll also have to think explicitly about how and what to say. But not only that, you'll also have to translate from language to language in your own head at the same time, because that's the only exposure to the language you've ever had. If the only way you've ever interacted with the language is via textbooks and apps, using a deductive approach where you try to explicitly memorize things and translate things between your native language and your target language, then it's no wonder you're going to have a hard time naturally using the language in situations where you ideally wouldn't want to have to think at all. So, what is the solution then? Well, if you use your brain and you look at how every single person on this earth has ever learned a native language, then you'll see it wasn't through textbooks, apps, or language classes. No, it was through getting exposure to that language every day and listening to it at home, at school, with friends, etc. So instead of thinking that you have to learn and memorize a whole new language, doing the exact same thing that every single failing language learner does, instead, you want to try to emulate the way that people get fluent in their native languages, and do the exact same thing a child would do, using comprehensible input instead. Now, using an immersion-based approach, or using comprehensible input as it's also called, really just means focusing on trying to understand messages in the language. Letting your brain naturally acquire it without thinking all too much. This is the exact same way we all learned our native languages, something I think I've said now 10 to 20 times in this video, but it's true, and it's the only way you're going to be able to learn a new language as well. So the easiest way to do this as an adult is by watching content and trying to understand things using the words you already understand, plus the visuals of the thing you're watching, to fill in the blanks and understand new words and acquire them naturally. Now, doing this with content that's a bit above your current level will help you regularly acquire new language, and do so in a natural way that eliminates the need to think when you want to use the language, and instead lets you use it like you would your native language. And this is something prolific linguist Stephen Krashen discovered way back in the 80s. So if you want to learn about this very effective approach, then check out the video on the screen right now, and I'll see you guys there. Thanks for watching.